Across Europe we keep finding his face, antlers rising like a crown, yet there is no story that tells us who he was. We can trace his image in stone and metal from Roman Gaul to the far north, but when it comes to tales, prayers, or rituals, the record falls silent. This is the mystery of Cernunnos, a vivid, recurring figure of the late Iron Age and Roman period, whose carved and cast features survive while his voice has disappeared without a trace. The evidence is spare and stubbornly visual. It begins, in modern terms, with a fragment of stone discovered beneath the nave of Notre-Dame in 1710, the Pillar of the Boatmen, a Roman period monument from the early 1st century CE. On this column, a horned, bearded man appears among Latin inscriptions and figures of Roman gods, and beside him, weathered but visible, are letters that many scholars have long read as an attempt at a name: Cernunnos, or something close to that. Yet the carving is worn, the inscription fragmentary, and the reading is not ironclad. Still, because of its age and context, this pillar has become the linchpin for identifying the horned figure seen across Western Europe. From that stone, the modern conversation begins. We can see him, but we cannot read his story. Look closely at the pillar. The man is not a generic wildman. He bears branching antlers, not the curled goat horns of Pan. Around his neck and on his arms, he wears torques, rigid metal neck rings commonly associated with status in Latin and Roman period Celtic societies. His posture is compact, almost private, as if seated or crouched. A ringed object and animals appear near him on other pieces of the pillar. The inscription beside him, where legible, seems to name him. Yet the letters are pockmarked by time, and alternative readings have been proposed. What survives most clearly is the image itself: antlers, torques, animals. From that image flowed a modern label, but not a myth. If you enjoy deep dives into ancient mysteries like this, subscribe and stay with us until the end for sources and further reading. A few decades after the Pillar of the Boatmen was carved, another depiction appears that forces a different question. How did contemporaries perceive this figure in relation to the Roman gods? The 1st century CE relief from Rheims shows the horned man seated cross-legged, flanked by familiar Roman deities, Apollo on one side, Mercury on the other. In his hand, he seems to hold or to receive a pouch that spills out what might be coins or grain. He is not a marginal or syncretized creature here, quietly renamed by Roman nomenclature. He sits among Roman gods as a distinct presence. That placement is suggestive in more than one way. To appear beside Apollo and Mercury implies recognition. The sculptor, patron, or public expected the audience to accept this figure as a deity of similar stature, not as a mere attribute of a Roman god. The purse or pouring object indicates a relationship with wealth, abundance, or exchange, but the exact meaning resists a simple label. Could this be a guardian of flocks and herds who also oversees prosperity? A local divine figure incorporated into civic representations? The relief suggests that, at least in Romano-Gallic art, the horned figure functioned as a recognizable divine persona. Yet again, the archaeological record offers more imagery than exposition. A few centuries later, the most iconic image associated with the horned god appears in a place that complicates matters: the Gundestrup cauldron, found in a peat bog in Denmark in 1891. One of the richly ornamented silver plates that form the cauldron's sides shows a seated horned figure much like the one on the pillar and the Rheims relief. Antlers, torques, a seated posture, and a surrounding menagerie that includes stags, bulls, and wolves. A ram-headed serpent coils in his hand, and animals press close as if under his control or protection. The Gundestrup cauldron adds layers to the puzzle. It was discovered in Denmark, but was likely manufactured further south or east, perhaps in workshops influenced by Thracian or Dacian styles, or even by skilled craftspeople operating in the Danubian or Gaulish spheres. The cauldron itself is a product of cross-regional exchange. Its imagery blends motifs and techniques from different artistic traditions. That mixing mirrors the very problem at hand. The horned figure appears across diverse geographies and media, yet without textual narrative tying the images into a single mythic biography. The cauldron's horned figure, with its ram-headed serpent, has haunted modern imagination and become the visual shorthand for what we call Cernunnos. But like the stone and the relief, it shows more than it tells. Certain visual elements recur and bear careful unpacking. The antlers are the most obvious, branching, stag-like, often rendered in profile with impressive detail. Across ancient societies, the stag is a figure of liminality, between forest and field, wildness and domestication, and the cyclic shedding and regrowth of antlers has long suggested motifs of seasonal renewal and virility. For an agricultural and pastoral society, an antlered deity could easily evoke control over wild game, protection of herds, or life cycle rhythms. Yet antlers can mean multiple things simultaneously: majesty, connection to untamed nature, and symbolic authority over animals. The torque is another consistent marker. Worn as a neck ring, the torque functioned as a sign of rank and identity in Latin and Roman period Celtic societies. When a divine image wears torques, the implication is not merely decorative. It speaks to the deity's association with elite identity, honor, and perhaps the social order that sustains wealth and protection. Some depictions show torques lying near the horned figure or offered to him, which could indicate a role as bestower or guardian of status and its material trappings. Then there is the ram-headed serpent, a motif that appears on the Gundestrup plate and on other objects. This creature merges characteristics that are at once chthonic and protective. The serpent often marks connections to the underworld, to cycles of death and rebirth, and to boundary-crossing powers. The ram's head adds association with virility, sacrificial power, or pastoral life. Scholars have suggested that the ram-headed serpent might symbolize renewal, guardianship of wealth, or a liminal being that belongs to both earth and sky. The precise significance is debated, and rightly so. Motifs that combine animals and serpents can accrue many layers of meaning in different contexts. Animals cluster around the horned figure in most representations. Stag and bull recur, and sometimes wolves or dogs. The presence of these creatures supports the long-standing hypothesis that the figure functioned in relation to animals, perhaps as a protector, master, or intercessor for hunters and herders. But Lord of Animals is a convenient shorthand, not a conclusive answer. The same imagery might as well indicate an integrative role, overseeing the boundaries between wild and domestic, life and death, abundance and scarcity. Each proposal is plausible. None is definitively provable from the iconography alone. The name matters, because names carry history and meaning. The reading Cernunnos traces back to letters on the pillar of the Boatmen, interpreted through linguistic reconstruction as deriving from a root meaning horn or antler. If that reading is correct, the name tells us primarily about appearance, the horned one. But the inscription itself is worn and incomplete. Alternate readings and doubts remain part of scholarly discussion. Even if the name is accepted, it supplies an external label without revealing ritual practice, mythic cycles, or theological nuance. A name that points to horns tells us how people identified the figure visually, not what they said about him around the hearth. Over the past 2 centuries, modern imaginations have tried to fill the silence. One common tendency has been to equate the horned figure with Pan, the goat-footed rustic god of Greek myth, or, more sensationally, with the Christian devil, a later demonized image with horns and cloven feet. Both equivalences are problematic. Pan, with his goat attributes and Greek pastoral associations, is iconographically and culturally distinct from the antlered, torque-wearing figure of the Latin and Roman Gaulish world. Chronology and regional artistic traditions diverge. Superficial similarities in horns obscure divergent meanings. As for equating the horned image with the devil, that conflates early medieval and later Christian symbolic shifts with pre-Christian European iconography. Horns were not a universal mark of evil in ancient Europe. They more often signaled potency, power, or connection to the animal world. The demonization of horned pagan imagery is a historical process, not evidence for original malign intent. Scholars have laid out multiple overlapping hypotheses about the horned figure's functions. He may have served as a personification of wild nature who protected game and livestock, as a fertility figure linked to abundance and seasonal cycles, as a guardian of material wealth or commerce. An interpretation suggested by the pouch in the ram's relief or as a chthonic or liminal deity associated with life-death renewal, implied by serpent iconography and the presence of animals connected to both wild and agricultural spheres. It is also plausible that different communities viewed him through different lenses at different times. A symbol can be polyvalent. To a hunter, he is lord of the chase. To a farmer, he is symbol of fecundity. To an urban patron, he is a guardian of prosperity. One challenge for interpretation is the profound silence when it comes to narrative. Unlike the Greco-Roman world, where myths, poems, and theological treatises offer contextual stories about deities, the Celtic and Gaulish landscape provides comparatively little textual testimony for local gods. Oral traditions may have persisted, but oral narratives are fragile in the archaeological record. Roman administrative, literary, and religious frameworks recorded and reinterpreted some local deities, often by identifying them with Roman gods, interpretatio Romana, yet the horned figure frequently resists straightforward Roman renaming. When he appears beside Roman gods, he keeps a distinct identity. This combination, visual prominence alongside textual absence, is the cause of much scholarly fascination and frustration. Cultural contact complicates the trail. Iron Age Europe was not a sealed world. Crafts, styles, and religious ideas moved across trade routes and through migration. The Gundestrup cauldron itself demonstrates artistic exchange between regions we now map as Gaul, the Danube Basin, and farther east. The horned figure's appearance across such varied contexts suggests either a mobile image that was adopted and adapted by many communities, or a set of similar but regionally distinct deities sharing overlapping symbolic repertoires. Either way, the archaeological record highlights movement and mixture rather than uniformity. Why did the story vanish? Several interlocking processes likely contributed. Roman conquest and subsequent cultural transformations changed civic life, patronage, and the contexts in which images were produced. Christianization, with its new liturgical and narrative frameworks, displaced many native cults and stories. Oral traditions can die out when the social settings that sustain them, ritual gatherings, hereditary priesthoods, or communal performances, are disrupted. Material loss is part of this. Carved stone erodes, metal is melted down, and perishable media vanish. The result is a discontinuity between vivid imagery and textual silence. We are left with a collection of carefully made objects and no surviving mythic narrative to explain them fully. Even so, the persistence of the image across time and space speaks to a strong shared symbolic resonance. The horned figure's repeated combination of antlers, torques, animals, and serpents suggests a suite of ideas ripe for communal use: authority over animals, connection to cycles of life and death, status and wealth, and a capacity to cross boundaries between worlds. To call him mysterious is not to deny the evidence, but to acknowledge the limits of what evidence can tell us. Objects speak. They do not read aloud their names and rights. The modern afterlife of this figure is itself instructive. In 19th and 20th century scholarship and popular culture, Cernunnos became a canvas onto which new meanings were projected. Nationalist imaginings, romantic reconstructions of a pan-Celtic past, and modern pagan revivals all found in the antlered image a potent emblem. These receptions reveal as much about modern needs as they do about ancient religiosity. They also caution us. The desire for a coherent, recoverable myth may lead to attractive but unsupported narratives. Responsible interpretation balances imagination with restraint, using the artifacts as anchors while resisting the temptation to invent rituals or stories not warranted by the data. What then does the horned figure teach us about the study of ancient religion? First, that material culture is an eloquent but incomplete witness. Images capture emphasis and iconography. They show what mattered visually and socially. Second, that names and labels acquired in modern times, however convenient, can mislead if their archaeological basis is uncertain. Third, that cultural contact and artistic mobility must be factored into hypotheses about identity. A similar image in different places can reflect diffusion, shared symbolic language, or parallel invention. Finally, that silence is itself an important datum. The absence of surviving mythic narratives forces scholars to be cautious, to consider multiple possibilities, and to remain open to new finds. The mystery is, in a sense, instructive. We hold in our hands a kind of negative testimony, vivid portraits without accompanying prose. The horned head looks out at us across centuries, antlers raised, talks glinting, animals pressed at its feet, while the stories that once could have explained his gestures are gone. That loss sharpens our attention to what remains. It makes the surviving artifacts louder, more arresting. It reminds us that history is partial, and that religious life in pre-modern Europe was complex, adaptable, and ultimately vulnerable to erosion. Scholars continue to argue, to publish, and to excavate. New finds or new readings of old finds might clarify parts of the puzzle. Epigraphic advances, comparative studies of iconography, and interdisciplinary work that brings environmental, economic, and social history into dialogue with art history all offer avenues for deeper understanding. Yet the central fact remains: a recognizable horned figure existed in the visual culture of Iron Age and Roman Europe. He occupied places of apparent prominence in civic and ritual spaces, and the narratives that might have explained him do not survive in any complete form. We can reasonably say what the figure likely embodied: authority in the animal world, a role in abundance and exchange, and a symbolic link to renewal and boundary crossing. But we should not pretend to recover sacred texts or liturgies that no longer exist. The tension between vivid image and missing story is not a flaw in the record, it is the record's truth. It teaches us humility in reconstruction, a careful weighing of evidence, and an appreciation for the fragmentary beauty of the past. So when you next see that antlered face, whether on a silver plate from a bog or on a weathered column once hidden beneath a cathedral, remember the paradox it represents. A god at once visible and voiceless. He is a reminder of how much can be preserved in metal and stone, and how much names, prayers, performance can be lost with the passage of time. The horned figure remains one of European religion's great puzzles, precisely because he resists the tidy categories we would like to impose. Which explanation seems most convincing to you? Was he a guardian of wild beasts, a god of abundance, a chthonic renewer, or some combination the objects only hint at? Tell us your theory in the comments, and check the description for recommended reading and sources if you want to explore this further. If this mystery intrigued you, consider watching more videos on ancient art and religion. There are many more fragments of past worlds waiting to be listened to.